Hitler took much of Europe during World War II, leaving some to wonder, would he try to take America too? With dreams of long-range bombers, massive warships, and even teaming up with Britain for a future showdown with the US, he could have brought the Nazi threat to American shores, if the war had turned in his favor.
I don't know how you begin to deal with that kind of madness, but that's who he was.
He may never have fully fessed up to it, but Hitler's recorded words make it pretty clear that he saw the US as a rival pretty early on. In an unpublished sequel to Mein Kampf, written in the late 1920s, Hitler argued that the US was in an expansionist frame of mind. Basically, he and the Nazis wanted to stop America from partnering with Europe, because they thought that that kind of alliance would let the US take over as the most powerful force in the world. This was framed as a fight for living space for German people.
The fascist cult of fire was an omen of the fire that was to consume the world.
That notion of living space was established well before the 20th century, but proved to be a key concept as the Nazis seized land, made war, and committed genocide. In a July 1941 meeting with Japanese Ambassador General Hiroshi Oshima, Hitler more clearly reiterated his stance and pushed for an alliance with Japan against the increasingly powerful US. According to the Journal of Modern History, Hitler thought America was behaving like a new imperial power, trying to expand in both Europe and Asia. In his view, Germany and Japan were each being attacked on different fronts, Russia on one side and the US on the other, and he concluded they needed to work together to, quote, annihilate them. Even after he declared war on America in December 1941, Hitler reportedly admitted that the US had huge advantages, like its overall industrial power and advanced technology.
How can we as Germans win? No way. We are going to lose.
Even though Hitler planned to face off against the US one day, he also thought that it contained the seeds of an ideal society. He pointed to so-called Nordics who had emigrated to the US and allegedly established themselves as industrious, upstanding members of their communities. European nations, in turn, were apparently experiencing a drain as these people moved away, making these places easier targets for Hitler.
Hitler saw the embodiment of everything he loathed: political intrigue, communists, Jews.
In Mein Kampf, he even wrote, "The racially pure and still unmixed German has risen to become master of the American continent." He claimed they would remain as such just as long as they kept that so-called unmixed status.
I mean, it's just insane.
But after the First World War, Americans weren't the biggest Germany fans, to say the least, so Hitler's chatter about German-American power didn't really hold up. Regardless, he praised America's strict immigration laws, which he believed helped keep the country pure. The so-called purity was one of the reasons he saw the US as a serious future opponent, and why he wanted to build a strong European empire, led by him, of course, to stand up against America's growing power. Though Hitler once thought of the US as a powerful opponent that would require serious planning to defeat, his views on that front had changed dramatically by the 1930s. Hitler believed that the US had succumbed to the mixing of races. Also, many see America's diversity as one of its major strengths. He painted it as a weakness, according to a book of essays called Germany, Hitler, and World War II. In his view, the mixing of races had created a degenerate society, one with a weak economy, a fatally dysfunctional political system, and no real culture. But not all Germans agreed with that no real culture argument. Black American music, for example, was majorly popular in pre-war Germany, even as top Nazis whined about the music style and tried to ban it. Even with all of these America is weak claims, it's not as if Hitler and friends were kicking back and lazily preparing for an easy win against the country. According to the book Hitler's Fatal Miscalculation, he knew the country's massive size and strong economy meant it could bounce back from economic shocks and grow more independently than many European nations. In his mind, America was weakened, but still far from harmless. What exactly did Hitler plan for the US in his fantasy of the long-term future? It's not totally clear, but some historians think he had a general framework, often called the Stufenplan, or if you prefer, stepping plan. Now, there's no evidence that Hitler or the other Nazi leaders used the term themselves, but there are clues that they wanted to take over territory in stages, starting in Europe and building an empire.
Nothing could stop Hitler now. His vision was unmatched by any other politician.
Some think that if that empire ever got powerful enough, one of the later steps would have almost certainly have been a confrontation with the United States. If Hitler and his followers had completed those early steps and were on the path to becoming a major power, a war or showdown with the US seemed inevitable. To have any chance of winning, the Nazis would have needed huge amounts of territory, resources, and manpower. Hitler recognized the possibility as early as the late 1920s, when he wrote his second book, which is now known simply as Hitler's Second Book, or Hitler's Secret Book. It was unpublished during his lifetime, but it eventually came out in 1961 and included his belief that Germany would end up fighting the US. Still, given how often Nazi policies shifted, sometimes dramatically, sometimes suddenly, it's hard to know how much weight to give this particular document. He's not exactly remembered as a careful long-term strategist. Hitler's long-term plans were muddy, and historians still argue over whether he truly wanted to dominate the entire world. But if he ever seriously thought about ruling the planet or even striking the US, there was one big obstacle: geography. Specifically, American territory was both really, really big and an entire ocean away. Crossing the Atlantic and trying to control such a massive territory would have stretched the limits of Germany's Air Force and Navy. Maybe the whole idea was so far-fetched that it was laughable. That's how Hitler played it off in a 1941 interview with a Life reporter, saying that invading the US was about as likely as Nazis going to the moon.
He was not yet the Führer he wanted to be.
Even if he secretly considered it, there was the matter of the US Navy, which was large and well-armed compared to Germany's naval forces. Traveling across the ocean to face such a force could prove devastating. Defeating the Americans at sea wouldn't just require boosting numbers of ships and sailors, but strategic placement of air and naval bases along the European side of the Atlantic. That's exactly what Hitler was doing in 1941 after taking France, but before declaring war on the United States. While Hitler was grabbing territory and quietly building up bases and naval forces through 1941, he wasn't talking about it to the press. By April that year, he had secretly promised Japan that Germany would join in if Japan declared war on the US. But in public, Hitler framed his actions as nothing more than the defense of Germany and its people.
Wir sind intolerant. Ich habe mir ein Ziel gesteckt.
Any claim that he had bigger ambitions was brushed off as ridiculous. In his same Life interview, his dismissive reactions to these suggestions were also meant to reassure. Of course, during that discussion, Hitler may have well had his fingers crossed behind his back. While denying expansionist plans, he was quietly buying time, building up forces, gathering supplies, and making preparations for the wider war he already had in mind.
Hitler's aimless wanderings gave the people the impression that their Führer was omnipresent.
If his interview also worked as propaganda to convince Americans that he wasn't a threat, all the better. But by this point, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was openly warning the country about the danger posed by the Nazis. By the end of 1941, after Pearl Harbor and Germany's own declaration of war on the United States, it was painfully clear that Hitler's intentions had never been a laughing matter. But as FDR confidently told Americans,
"We will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God."
While the ocean between Germany and the US was far beyond the range of the German Navy or its air forces, there were still ambitious plans to make some sort of strike across that distance. The main problem, of course, was figuring out how to actually make it that far. By 1940, Hitler ordered the development of a long-range bomber program that was known as the America Bomber. The idea was that the plane could take off from the Azores, islands in the middle of the Atlantic controlled by Portugal, which at the time was friendly with Germany. But that plan collapsed once the Allies established a base there in 1943. German airplane and weapons designers tried to come up with alternate plans and designs, but nothing ever came to full production or use. And even if it had, the plane would have only been able to drop a single bomb. It might have been devastating if it struck a crowded city, causing terrible destruction and loss of life, but it still wouldn't have been enough to truly cripple the United States. Post-war chaos made it even harder to know exactly how far the program got or how close it came to reality. What seems clear is that Hitler dreamed of a dramatic, symbolic strike on a major American city. Albert Speer was a Nazi architect and Minister of War Production by Hitler's side.
With Albert Speer and other architects, he planned the rebuilding of numerous cities, often producing sketches of his ideas.
Speer later wrote that Hitler spoke about attacking the US with excitement. In the book Spandau, The Secret Diaries, Hitler is described as fantasizing about skyscrapers being turned into gigantic burning torches, collapsing onto one another, the glow of the exploding city illuminating the dark sky. While some Nazi engineers were trying to design long-range bombers that could reach New York, others were focused on battleships that could stand up to the US Navy, even after crossing the Atlantic to American waters. Alongside standard-sized battleships and aircraft carriers, they drew up plans for what we now call the H-class battleships. These ships would have been bigger and more powerful than both American and Japanese battleships at the time. The largest design, the H-44, would have weighed about 140,000 tons and carried 8 massive 20-inch guns. If a US warship had run into one of these monsters, the crew would have been in serious danger. And unlike some of the more far-fetched German aircraft projects, there's evidence that a couple of H-class battleships were actually started, but records show neither made it to the water. They were scrapped right there in the shipyards. In the end, much like the America bomber, the H-class battleships turned out to be another failed project that mainly wasted time and resources in the middle of an already demanding world war. Even in his more fantastical moments, Hitler must have known that actually occupying the US was nearly impossible. But if he gained enough power, he could still try to hurt America in other ways, like hitting the Allies right in the wallet. Life magazine asked Hitler if a German victory could wreak economic havoc on the US. The reporter figured Germany's strict control over workers, the kind of rules Americans would never accept, could give it an edge. Hitler brushed that off, saying conditions weren't as bad as outsiders thought. And besides, the war had interrupted progress anyway. He also claimed Germany was too small to really threaten the US, though that ignored his dreams of empire building. Still, Nazi Germany did use economic warfare. It had already exploited the chaos of Weimar Germany to seize power, and then turned the economy around with strict controls like banning imports. And if that momentum had continued, it could have made anti-US economic retaliation a real threat. They even tried economic sabotage abroad, like when Nazi agents attempted to crash the British economy with counterfeit bills in what became known as Operation Bernhard. As much as Hitler and the Nazis ranted about America's so-called degeneracy, there were things they admired about the US, especially its racist laws. In fact, these laws became case studies for the Nazis. If they had ever taken over America, it's almost certain that they would have kept these policies and pushed them even further. That included segregation laws, widely known as Jim Crow. These were so notorious that Nazis studied them closely when designing their own discrimination against Jewish people and other groups they considered undesirable. The infamous Nuremberg laws, which stripped Jewish Germans of citizenship, were directly inspired by US policies that denied citizenship to indigenous people. Nazis also looked at state-level bans on interracial marriage, with harsh punishments for anyone who broke the law. They put similar bans in place to block marriages between Jewish and non-Jewish people. And when it came to deciding who was considered Jewish, they again borrowed from US policy, though they actually went a step softer, if you can even call it softer, than America's infamous one-drop rule, which declared that anyone with even the smallest trace of black ancestry was legally black. If the Nazis had somehow gotten enough troops and firepower across the Atlantic, taken over the US, and held on to it, they wouldn't have stopped there. Evidence suggests that they may have continued one of their most horrific policies: genocide. The clearest sign comes from a German-language book now held by Library and Archives Canada. It once belonged to Hitler and was commissioned by the Nazi Party. Its title translates to Statistics, Press, and Organizations of Jewry in the United States and Canada. Inside, it lists Jewish populations across both nations, from large cities to small towns. The book doesn't outright spell out plans for genocide, but history does tell us that this kind of data collection often comes first. Before the Holocaust in Europe, the Nazis compiled similar statistics. That's what makes this book so chilling. It shows how the groundwork may have already been laid. As one curator at Library and Archives Canada told The Guardian, the book demonstrates that the Holocaust wasn't a European event. It was an event that didn't have the opportunity to spread out of Europe. Even casual students of World War II know that Britain and Germany weren't exactly allies. The two were bitter enemies, with Germany launching devastating bombing campaigns and blockades against the British, who hit back in return. So why did Hitler ever imagine Britain could be a partner with Germany against the United States? It's hard to pin down, but his own speeches show he at least hoped Britain, under German control of course, could one day be useful in a fight against America. According to selected essays from Intelligence and Strategy by John Robert Ferris in September 1941, Hitler said, "I will not live to see it, but I am happy for the German folk that it will one day witness how Germany and England united will line up against America." And he was still talking that way the following year. For Hitler's wartime conversations, Hitler said, "One day England will be obliged to make approaches to the continent, and it will be a German-British army that will chase the Americans from Iceland." If Hitler had ever managed to take over the United States, the country's booming film industry would have kept going, but in a very different way. As it stood, Hitler had a particular interest in American movies and understood the power of flashy propaganda films. In private, and occasionally even in public, he sometimes watched several films in a single night, whether they were German, British, French, or even American. He also commissioned homegrown propaganda films like the now infamous Triumph of the Will in 1935, which glorified a massive Nazi rally in Nuremberg. As much as he publicly liked to criticize American culture, in truth, he was impressed by Hollywood, at least until the war began. By the 1940s, he was far more focused on newsreels and how he personally looked in them. Hollywood's relationship with Hitler was far more complicated than you might think. Sure, you may remember the strongly anti-Nazi film Casablanca from 1942.
I have my orders.
Oh, I see. Gestapo spank.
My dear Ricky, you overestimate the influence of the Gestapo. I don't interfere with them, and they don't interfere with me.
But before that, studio executives often bent to Nazi demands. A researcher for The Hollywood Reporter uncovered evidence that Hollywood allowed Nazi officials to edit film scripts, shut out Jewish creators, and may have even pressured a German MGM executive to divorce his Jewish wife. Not everyone in the industry supported this, and things changed once Germany declared war on the US. Still, it shows how, under the right circumstances, Hollywood executives might have once again bowed to Hitler. If the Nazis had taken over the United States, a few Americans probably would have benefited. At the top of that list was Henry Ford. The famous industrialist was openly anti-Semitic and promoted conspiracy theories that Jewish people secretly controlled the world. In 1918, he bought the Dearborn Independent newspaper and used it to spread these ideas. Copies were even available at Ford dealerships, and some new car owners reportedly found one inside their vehicle. Ford's reputation reached all the way to Germany. In 1938, the Nazis awarded him the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, and Hitler himself spoke highly of him. But running his company in nationalist Germany wasn't simple. The German branch even used slave labor in at least one plant from 1941 to 1945. Another American figure who had ties to the Nazis was famed aviator Charles Lindbergh. When he toured Germany in the late 1930s, he admired the country's aviation industry and was given a medal by a German Air Force commander. He refused to give it back, even as war approached. Lindbergh pushed racist ideas, argued for America First policies, and in 1941 was even photographed giving a Nazi salute at a rally. Privately, he wrote that America had too many Jewish people, but as the US entered the war, his outspoken pro-Nazi views destroyed his political career. Even while Nazi Germany was at war, they still had some supporters in the US. The biggest was the pro-Nazi German-American Bund, but these groups weren't some secret army waiting for orders from Hitler. Sure, they dressed like Nazis, marched around, made children's groups similar to the Hitler Youth, and even held a 1939 rally at Madison Square Garden with American flags and George Washington right alongside swastikas. But soon, actual German officials wrote them off as fringe oddballs. Meanwhile, the US government was shutting down any real support networks. By mid-1941, months before Pearl Harbor, FDR already knew war was coming. His administration froze Axis assets, shut down German-friendly propaganda outlets, and closed all German consulates except the embassy in D.C. Leaders of the Bund faced persecution, including Fritz Kuhn, who was later convicted of larceny and eventually deported to Germany after the war. The Bund itself quickly faded, officially disbanding after Pearl Harbor. And even if it somehow survived a Nazi-controlled America, it likely would have been ignored as a powerless fringe group. While Hitler often spoke about the supposed impurity of the United States, there were some rumors that Nazis considered certain American Indian tribes to be Aryan. That claim has never been confirmed, but we do know the German-American Bund tried to build relationships with tribes. There are even suggestions that Germany toyed with the idea of sparking indigenous revolts in the Americas, uprisings tied to very real racist policies that marginalized Native people. Most American Indian people rejected the idea, including the Native American code talkers who proudly served in the US military. But there were a few exceptions. One was Chief Red Cloud, who was actually a Portland lawyer named Elwood Towner. He strongly advocated for indigenous rights, but eventually became convinced that Jewish people were behind many of the problems he fought against. That belief led him to align with the Nazis and the German-American Bund, and he sometimes even spoke of a personal connection to Hitler. Another group linked to Towner, the American Indian Federation, was led by Creek man Joseph Bruner. Like Towner, he fought against discriminatory laws targeting American Indians. But in doing so, his organization appeared to some investigators as aligning with fascism, especially because of its push against communism and its support for assimilation policies. Another American Indian Federation member, Seneca activist Alice Lee Jemison, even went so far as to accept financial backing from individuals and groups with Nazi ties. Ultimately, while there are pieces of evidence that suggest Hitler had his eye on the US as potential territory, there's no solid proof of an actual plan to occupy the country.
After 12 years in power and 6 years of war, the Nazi regime has come to an end.
But there were hints, like the development of long-range bombers and plenty of Americans assuming he was aiming for world domination. In fact, a 1941 Fortune magazine poll found that 72% of Americans believed that was Hitler's endgame. But was there really a plan, a blueprint? Even just an outline sketched on a napkin? No, not as far as anyone can tell. Looking at the overall shape of Hitler's strategy, his obsession with racial purity and power, and his tendency to push toward grand goals while ignoring practical concerns like supply lines, there's plenty of reason to think the US would have been in his sights eventually. Yet in that atmosphere of fanaticism and propaganda, despite all those meetings where Hitler stood over maps, a concrete plan for actually occupying the United States may have been the most far-fetched idea of all.
He almost destroyed civilization as we know it during the 20th century. I don't think that history will ever forgive him, or should it.